Now, within the African context, Wagner's footprint extends across a broad spectrum of endeavors encompassing military operations, the provision of security services, and alleged involvement in resource exploitation. Acting as a quasi-mercenary entity, the group stands accused of fueling conflicts and exacerbating political crises in several countries, including Libya, Sudan, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Both state and non-state actors have sought the services of Wagner, enticed by its perceived capabilities, discretion, and purported effectiveness. The African theater has witnessed the deployment of Wagner operatives engaging in combat operations, training local forces, and offering strategic guidance. Their presence has raised concerns about human rights abuses, violations of international norms, and the potential for destabilization. As we delve into this complex topic, we will shed light on the motivations behind Wagner's foray into Africa, the consequences of their actions, and the geopolitical dynamics that underpin their engagements. And joining us from the Ugandan capital, Kampala, is Simon Mulongo. Simon is an international relations specialist. He was a member of the 9th Parliament for the Pearl of Africa, representing Bubulo County East in Manafwa District. In the 9th Parliament, Mulongo served as a vice chairperson of the Committee on Defense and Internal Affairs and as a member of the Committee on Rules, Privileges and Discipline and the NRM Parliamentary Caucus. He is a security analyst and consultant in Eminent Frontiers. Thank you so much for joining us on One Slot.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm grateful to have another time with you.
Wonderful. Thanks for granting the invitation. And now straight into discussions, we're looking at what exactly Wagner Group is. We've heard so much news about it. So first of all, how does it operate within the African context?
Well, the Wagner Group is a Russian mercenary group, meaning that they are not part of the defense, the national defense and the military of Russia, Federation of Russia, but they have a relationship with the top notch of the Russian defense system. They're private military, and they are available for hire. Its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was initially in the hospitality industry and is linked to the current president of the Federation of Russia, the President Putin. And he managed to raise this private army in a manner that is not very clear. And the first time that Wagner Group were seen was when Russia invaded Crimea and annexed it. And that's how they came in as green men, the little green men, but later on they came to be clearly known as the Wagner Group. And in Africa, they've been invited by a number of countries available on hire to help them sort out some national pressing issues related to military and defense. And those are the countries that you managed to count. They include Libya, include Mali, include Central African Republic, and also the Sudan, where they're supporting one of the factions in the Sudan.
Now, Simon, correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned, I'm liking the fact that you mentioned the African countries. We're going to go delve deeper into all of this. But you also mentioned something about the Wagner Group being a private company, a private military company. And we know from research that private companies are illegal in Russia. So how exactly does this company come to operate, and how is it funded?
Of course, they are self-sustaining. They're mainly funded by themselves, only that the initial capitalization was done by the Russian defense system, in which they managed to provide training, exercising, and also to provide support in terms of enablers, such as technical intelligence, and also in terms of perhaps additional military capacities that are employed for special operations. So somehow, even if they're a private army, they have quite a leeway and solid relationship with the Russian defense system.
So despite the fact that it's illegal, it's still able to operate and even have its own context in Africa, despite being illegal in a way.
Well, that is an interesting question. Are they illegal? Well, I don't think in terms of international order, we have clear-cut legal regime that can prohibit or inhibit them from operating. Because remember, countries are sovereign. And when they're sovereign, they can hire and employ and deploy those resources that they can feel they are not available within their domestic architecture. So if a country is free to do that, to hire and employ and deploy such forces, then the question of illegalities may not arise. Because that means then bilateral, they're capable of hiring. You can hire expatriates from IMF and World Bank. You can hire groups from wherever they want to come from to be able to support you. So I think that is quite a slippery path, whether we can regard the Wagner Group as being hired by some governments, particularly say in Africa, as being illegal.
Okay, let's come back to the African context. You mentioned about 8 countries. We've seen Chad, we've seen Mali, we've seen the Central African Republic, since 2018. And when you talked about the reasons why they're in Africa, one thing comes to the mind of a lot of people, and that's the security situation in all of it. So how much influence does it have in Africa when we look at the stability in Africa?
Of course, they have immense influence, because what I want you to know, and the viewers, is that of all the apparatus of the state that makes a state stand as one is the military, because the military, which is the ultimate defender of the constitutional order, and they're the ones who can guarantee sovereignty. So when you talk about integrity of the sovereign state, they must be able to safeguard their borders, the territorial borders, and be able to guarantee and its assets within the country. Now, whoever plays that lead role becomes extremely important. As you may know, that most of the governments in Africa have been overthrown by their own militaries, either from within or sometimes by some groups that come from outside, whether, for example, the CIA plot and facilitate a coup, or even some mercenary come from another country, or even a force, a legit force from another country, carrying out a coup in another country, or actually carrying out an open war until a given regime is overthrown. So that places the military at the center stage of any state to talk about in terms of importance for guaranteeing security and stability of a given country. So whoever plays this role becomes extremely important. So the Wagner Group coming in to play a role either with the national army or military that may be weak for that matter, or they're capable of influencing the destiny of a given country, they become extremely important, because then they determine the destiny of that country. They determine the longevity of a given regime in that country. And for that matter, they determine the relations between that country and other countries within the region, or even by far other states. So Wagner Group coming in to play the role they're playing in, they are actually becoming extremely important, indispensable element of forces on our continent, our continental soil.
Now, this extremely important content in the African soil, we're looking at a situation where Africans have been looking to emancipate themselves. We're looking at African solutions to African problems, but still in the context of the Wagner Group, which is, if you put it, a country that is under Russia. For some time, we've seen Francophone countries trying to alienate from their colonial masters, which is France. We've seen situations in Mali where they've called for the withdrawal of different peacekeeping missions, especially in France. So is Africa going from France to Russia? How exactly are you seeing this playing out?
No, I'm sorry, you may have to rephrase the question. I did not get you well.
All right. I said, we're looking at situations where there have been so much anti-France sentiments in Africa. And from one side, we go way away from France. And then on the other side, it seems that Africa is having more allies in Russia. So how are we seeing this playing out? The relationship between Africa and Russia with the importance of the Wagner mercenaries?
Yeah, that's a good one. First of all, the Wagner forces in Africa have been invited by the Africans, particularly those countries that feel stressed and they want to be supported. And so they invite the Wagner Group. But then there are issues that go with it. As you said clearly, the geopolitical global order is such that the West is pitted against the East, and specifically Russia in this case. So whoever invites the Russian component of the military into Africa becomes directly challenging the Western influence in those respective areas. And as such, who faces the Western interests in their countries and their region, who opposes them is seen to be likely supportive of the Russian. And who supports the Russian move in Africa is seen to be opposed to the Western countries' support or interest in their own specific areas. Definitely, Africa becomes a battleground between the West and the East. And this is very reminiscent of the Cold War, in which the West and the East were battling on the soils of Africa. That's one. The other one is the modus operandi of the Wagner Group. They operate as mercenaries and not as nationals who are supposed to be patriotic. And because they're not patriotic at all, theirs is for pay. You either pay me my paycheck or I don't do your work. And once you pay me, I'll do your work and leave. And that means issues of human rights are not taken into consideration. Issues of national interest in the sense of ensuring that there is unity and development of a given country is not their priority. So they just operate the way they do, whether it's blind offensive operations or they're actually conscious of anything, they do not care at all.
Okay. Now, Simon, sorry to cut you short. I mean, there's a whole lot to talk about, and I'm going to bring it fast forward to what we're seeing presently between Russia. We've seen the leader also of the Wagner Group, that's Yevgeny Prigozhin, and we're seeing a situation where it's somewhat looking like the group has been disbanded. Meanwhile, we have its operations still active in Africa. What remains the fate of it? What are we next to see with situations going on between Wagner and the Russian military?
Between Africa and the Wagner Group?
Yes, with its supposed disbandment, with what is going on in Russia.
Well, of course, this is a very interesting development for the Wagner Group. When they made a move against the hand that feeds them, and they wanted to march onto Moscow, even if they're claiming that they were not after President Putin, but they were actually after punishing the Minister of Defense. What we know is that on Saturday, the truce that was reached between the Wagner Group and Moscow, that was brokered by Belarus, is such that they are going to relocate to Belarus, and that's where they're going to be. And they've been offered facilities where they're going to be encamped. And the government of Belarus does not rule out the fact that the Wagner Group can continue with their services in a manner that they will then fit. And the president of Belarus has already directed his Minister of Defense to engage the leader of the Wagner Group to see how best they can continue offering the services. At the same time, of course, some of them who may not join their boss have been free or asked to be integrated into the Russian defense forces. So this leaves the Wagner Group in balance, but also doesn't mean that the Wagner Group is gone. It is not, because the leader remains and the group remains, at least by name, and they have capacity to reorganize.
But Simon, what has happened? Should Africa still rely on them? Because largely you talk about so many African countries that are relying on it for its military support, even though some of them deny it. With all this that is going on and the fact that it's supposedly looking like a rebel group, even for its own leader, Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, it seems not to have a control of the Wagner Group. Should Africa still rely on this Wagner mercenaries?
Well, the point I made was that the Wagner Group is not necessarily neutralized. And they've been given green light to reorganize. And that means they will remain available. Or the
reorganization is that they should be under the Russian military or they should stay in Belarus.
Well, in as far as Belarus is concerned, they're going to remain as Wagner Group. And the Ministry of Defense is actually actively engaging the Wagner Group leadership at the moment as we speak. Now, only those elements that were not persuaded to leave with the leader to Belarus are the ones who have been given opportunity to be integrated in the Russian National Defense Forces. So this means that those who are abroad and on missions most likely may.
Simon, are you still with us? All right, we're still discussing the assessing Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary Wagner Group in Africa. We've looked at situations and is going on, how the Wagner Group came to be. It's supposedly supposed to be a private military company in Russia. But we're also seeing present situations in Russia where there has been a stage of a supposed coup where we saw Wagner mercenaries go out to protest, but it was called on halt. And the latest situation is the fact that this group, according to the president, Russian President Vladimir Putin, should join the Russian military due to its act that Vladimir Putin calls an act of betrayal or treason, or staying in Belarus. So the question is, African countries that are deeply reliant on the Wagner Group for its security, should it still rely on it, or should Africa look for alternative sources, for example, regional sources to deal with security situations in Africa? Unfortunately, this is where we'll have to call it a stop on today's edition of One Slot, while we continue to look at various alternatives that Africa can look into to make sure that it protects its sovereignty and, of course, the integrity of the nation Africa. I am Rita Amodia. Thank you so much for joining me on today's One Slot. Till next time, I'm Rita Amodia. Bye-bye.